Welcome to the Immutable Ledger. I'm Samuel Dempsey. On December 4th, the Trump administration released its national security strategy, a document that's less a policy roadmap and more of an ideological manifesto. It warns of Europe's civilizational erasure, and an leaked, longer version proposes pulling Austria, Hungary, Italy, and Poland away from the EU. And it suggests a core five that includes China and Russia while excluding Europe entirely. To parse through this national security strategy and the latest on the negotiations in Ukraine, Trump's transactional foreign relations, and the importance of soft power and commercial advisory, I'm joined by Pablo Rasmussen. Pablo is the director of Brzezinski Global Strategies, and he has seen American foreign policy from all angles, advising Fortune 500 companies on European investment risk, managing the Peace Corps operations across 61 countries during the Biden administration, and now helping CEOs navigate geopolitical turbulence. He also writes on his Substack, The Adret, a newsletter that curates essays, articles, and stories about international and national issues. He is uniquely equipped to talk about these ranging strategic and market implication questions of the last few weeks. With that, here's my conversation with Pablo. Pablo, thank you so much for being on the show. It's a pleasure to have you.
It's a pleasure to join you.
Let's first dive into this national security strategy. So in the opening address, which is probably the only part that Trump read, we have, quote, starting on my first day in office, we restored the sovereign borders of the United States and deployed the U.S. military to stop the invasion of our country. And in the line after, we, quote, got woke lunacy out of our armed services. From the get-go, this document to me looks like prioritization of the culture war as a foremost security initiative, which I think is reflected in this administration. And interestingly, unlike the 2017 national security strategy, we don't have China and Russia being called revisionist powers. So before we dive in, what's your one-line takeaway from this strategy?
It's important to contextualize the document, right? A national security strategy is only as important as it reflects the vision of the president. I don't think the 2017 strategy reflected that vision, and I don't think this one does either. And so, to that point, it is a purely ideological document. It is a document that represents the views of some of the voices in the administration that are trying to make, occupy space, take up some room on the agenda and catch both the president's attention, but also the attention of kind of our allies and rivals. And in that sense, it's very successful. It's an ideological document, and it presents a position, but it should not be interpreted to be maybe the true strategy, if there is any at all, of national security in the U.S.
Yeah, I think that's a fair take. I think once we get this defense strategy, that maybe will be more so of the case, we'll see. But to get into this one, for the purpose of the conversation, let's focus on four regional implications: Latin America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. So first, on Latin America, the document says it's time for a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, where the U.S. has regional supremacy in the Western Hemisphere and other powers are to stay out, reflected in the EU's current hesitancy to pursue its own goals in the region. And the document says, quote, the era of mass migration must end. Border security is the primary element of national security. We must protect our country from invasion, not just from unchecked migration, but from cross-border threats such as terrorism, drugs, espionage, and human trafficking. The document also writes that this admin has, quote, a predisposition to non-interventionism, which I kind of love that. I think that's a funny little thing. It's not, they don't believe it or they're not going to do it. None of the things they campaigned on, but just they're not really leaning that way. So how do you articulate this strategy in Latin America, and what do you think the implications are?
I mean, the Western Hemisphere emphasis was particularly surprising, right? So we got leaks of it, which I assume were deliberate, several weeks before the strategy came out, and everybody was quite surprised at the Western Hemisphere. But in a way that reflects both that Combo is kind of the restrainer thread in the administration, right? Represented both by people like the vice president and many others, but also a true call out to the fact that the priority here is domestic politics, that there is a strain within both the Republican Party and the MAGA movement that see American foreign policy as having been far too aventuristic, far too interventionist over the last few decades. And they want to bring, the U.S. back to a sphere of influence. You see this also in the dialogue, and I'm not sure this is entirely shared by the authors of the strategy and reflected, that the world should be divided in kind of spheres of influence, Russia, China, and the U.S. The Western Hemisphere squarely fits as the kind of the U.S. sphere, and therefore the call out to the Monroe Doctrine, which, is a nice call out to, the people that paid attention in history class, and you can assume that many of the authors that are more ideologically inclined did. So it is a surprising move, in terms of this has not really been the priority in U.S. foreign policy for some time. There have been symbolic kind of actions. Usually a president's first trip has been to either, Mexico or Canada. That has been kind of an on and off since the Bill Clinton era, not terribly reliably, and was not the case this time around, but nor in the first Trump administration. But now there's clear signs that, you want to do this, but it is deeply tied to domestic politics, right? Migration and drugs. And those are big, big priorities. Those are concerns that were raised during the election. There are people within the White House, within the administration, within the Republican Party, and within Congress on both sides of the aisle that believe that the concern about both kind of fentanyl, heroin becoming a national security concern and a domestic policy concern, and then also immigration, where, there are particularly a group of centrist Democrats that also believe that that was part of the reason why President Biden lost the election, or Vice President Harris eventually. Obviously, that's up for debate, but clearly this is trying to address very directly the concerns. And in that way, the national security strategy is often a Christmas tree, right? Everybody gets to hang their own little bauble on it, and it ends up being non-strategic in that strategies are required to prioritize. You have to kind of commend this one for picking one pretty strong priority. It's a controversial one. It's one that is already, we can see in Venezuela particular actions about it, but it clearly points out what it thinks is it's the main area of concern and one that ties to domestic concerns. So if nothing else, it seems like there's a direction there. Whether that will end up being reflected over the next 3 years, we'll see. That seems unlikely, but that is, I think, the position it is in Latin America. And I think it puts a lot of our partners in Latin America in a very awkward position. We should never forget that foreign policy first begins with a relationship with other countries and other people in those countries. And, American adventurism in the Western Hemisphere has it terribly unpopular in much of Latin America and makes it very difficult for the leaders of these countries to want to collaborate with the U.S. if this is kind of the top line.
Are there strategic implications for how Latin America then should be viewing how to react to this, or the agreements with the European Union right now that have been manifesting for some time? Should they be more reluctant to engage? Do they have to stay to the U.S., or how do you interpret that aspect of things?
We're talking the day before there might or might not be a final kind of vote on some of the measures around the EU-Mercosur deal. And so TBD what will happen there, but it seems mostly the burden of doing something or not doing something continues to sit with the EU that is hesitant about doing something there. But I think in Latin America, Latin America is going to keep hedging its bets on various players and various relationships. The Mercosur deal seems like something that is, quite mutually beneficial to both, despite some disagreement in Europe. I see no reason why they wouldn't want to pursue this, and I don't particularly see the Trump administration paying particular attention to trade that doesn't involve the U.S. So to me, that seems pretty clear. I think the signal in the strategy is that the Trump administration is going to look very, very closely at Latin America's relationship with China and find it completely unacceptable that a lot of the governments have fostered deeper relationships with China, deeper, occasionally some relationships with Russia that's mostly kind of relegated to the Venezuelans and Cubas. But particularly the relationship with China is going to become a major sticking point. You see countries like Mexico that are both very dependent on the U.S. economy, that are coming closer to the U.S., that are pushing back against China. This is going to, have implications for countries like Mexico, but the situation will be very different in a country like Peru or Chile or Argentina.
Yeah.
And so those are tricky relationships. Yeah.
So we're going to get into this bigger question a little bit later as well, more in depthly. But at the center of that really is this kind of soft power question. And this document talks about how it would like to have the greatest soft power. The U.S. is the best with soft power. But as we know, they're completely gutting the soft power mechanisms and tools of the U.S. government. So how do you see that relation with China, who is really executing on soft power in the region, to kind of win over these relationships, or just purely execute on the strategy that it's articulating?
Yeah, I'm hesitant to compliment this document too much, but I'm also quite happy to hear that it mentions soft power. I think, sometimes the great power competition that we're currently in feels very contested, at least in dialogue, in terms of what are you doing to bolster your own hard power. But soft power is an enormously important element to this, and I think something that the last 3 U.S. administrations have been quite hesitant to really have a concerted strategy to promote and to do something about. That also comes at a time in which, the U.S. has blown up one of its big tools of soft power, which was USAID, and a handful of other development agencies that kind of went by the wayside in that way. It's at the same time as, the administration attacked U.S. universities and international students, another incredibly influential tool of soft power, as it attacked science funding, energy, funding for renewable energy, another source of American soft power. This is where you kind of see the gap between like some of the ambitions of the document and the ambitions of the people working on the document and the real implementation of the ground, which is that they don't, quite square away with each other terribly well. But this is something that, we should be thinking about. And I think we shouldn't also estimate that much of the soft power that the U.S. has is not really within the power for the U.S. government to change. Barring conversations about who owns movie studios, but American movies are, big part of American soft power. And in the end, the people in the driver's seat of American soft power, and therefore for much of American foreign affairs, are Americans themselves. Where that leads, I think Americans themselves have still somewhat of both a slightly interventionist and definitely a strong internationalist spirit with them, while also being kind of fiercely independent and fiercely, self-determining in that. And that's long been a source of soft power, and that doesn't go away when somebody different is in the White House, and the rest of the world should continue to take into account that the relationship is first with the American people and then with its government.
That's very well said. So let's move on to Europe, which I think is arguably the most concerning portion of this document. It says, quote, "We should preserve Europe's civilizational self-confidence and Western identity," focusing most of the section on the economic decline of Europe, which is very reasonably put, and I think was also very, reasonably received, actually, that side over here. But then it writes that, quote, "The real and more stark prospect is of civilizational erasure." Another fun quote that you can pull out of this is that the days of the United States propping up the entire world order like Atlas are over, and it emphasizes greater burden sharing and it talks about the accomplishment of getting Europe to agree to spend 5% of GDP on defense. So what are your thoughts on this part of the section?
How incredibly ironic to make a comment about European civilization through an allusion to like a Greco-Roman kind of figure, right? Like you're just proving that, as long as we still have Atlas references, then we still have some sort of European civilization, if such a thing ever existed, to discuss. But I think for Europe, this document shouldn't have come as a surprise at all, right? It's been nearly a year since the vice president's speech in Munich. It's been nearly a year of this administration. Have you not seen that this is a clear thread among some people in the administration?
Yeah.
Of course. And, I think it's convenient for some politicians, and this is not necessarily wanting to be a cynical take, but it's a convenient thing for European politicians to criticize this because it's grabbing the headlines and because it buys you some political capital for, whatever you're going to do. Great, go ahead. But substantively, nobody should be surprised about this. And I don't think, Europeans are going to be radically changing their strategy based on a document that by New Year's, I think we will have all forgotten about. Maybe not, but possibly.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think part of, actually what is sounding great. I mean, of course, it was kind of the cherry on top of sounding the alarm. But I think what even has sounded a little bit more alarms is this leaked longer version of the national security strategy over here, which calls for a full U.S. withdrawal of Europe's defense, which they've also talked about repeatedly. No one's really surprised there. And to, quote, "make Europe great again," directly having that in there, which that I think is a little jarring. But again, this is the leaked one. The administration denies that they had a role in this document anyways, but this is what we're hearing. And then most concerningly, that the U.S. should push Austria, Hungary, Italy, and Poland away from the European Union. And this would be directly in line with the Heritage Foundation's mega agenda, which they're now pursuing in Europe. So for Europe, if you take this leaked strategy to mean anything at all for what this administration thinks, and obviously it does for much of the strands and partners within it, this admin seems to be kind of looking at Europe as the tip of the spear for this ideological, transnational, far-right assault to erode democracy and regulation, which means eroding the EU on the continent. So do you share this view of kind of what can be interpreted from this document, from this kind of Brussels perspective?
I mean, one, I wouldn't necessarily take this leaked draft very seriously. It is my understanding that this is a draft document. Brussels is very familiar with leaked draft documents that say egregious things, maybe not, quite as egregious as this.
Yeah.
Again, you should judge the outcomes based on people's actions, and you should be prepared for anything, but see where they walk the walk, and you see the example there. U.S. administration officials have met with far-right figures in both Germany and France within the last week. So This is not wholly unprecedented. But the takeaway from this is not that the U.S. administration is necessarily, actively on a crusade to destroy Europe, whatever Europe may mean. It's that they are in a particular, that some people in the administration, if not a good chunk of them, are dogmatically in favor of supporting their ideological allies, which without the U.S. help are doing quite well in Europe already. So, both of the far-right figures that the U.S. administration officials chose to meet with this week are members of parties that are likely to win the next election, or that at least polls indicate that are likely to win the next election. It is actually relatively standard diplomatic practice, and not that this excuses that decision, but it's standard diplomatic practice for U.S. diplomats to meet with people across the political spectrum of countries that are our treaty allies to understand where the future of politics goes. And I mean, European diplomats are in Washington, D.C., meeting with both Democrats and Republicans the entire time. Ideology or agreement or disagreement notwithstanding, that is part of the process of diplomacy. Generally, there has been a red line to not cross between these extremist parties. That red line is clearly no longer there. But European, officials should be more worried about, the fact that there are some clear concerns about, the state of the economy in Europe, the state of life, and that there's real discontent being challenged within their systems. And frankly, the U.S. officials should be much less concerned about internal politics within other European countries and start addressing the real crises that are happening in the United States, like the affordability crisis, like problems with, housing, or a dozen of other issues, and stop trying to figure out, who are the ideological allies that you want to line up with that are going to, save some vague idea of civilization that may or may not exist.
Yeah. I mean, I think two things that you kind of touched on there that kind of open up a bit of the European perspective on it is, first, kind of, you talk about like leaks are a normal thing in Europe, in the EU especially, that people are well familiar with. But I think part of it is that the Commission oftentimes do kind of like intentional leaks to test the waters a bit. And so I think many in the Brussels bubble see this leaked document as like, wait, is this actually what they're really trying to signal to us? And so there's a bit of that kind of like, precondition to see things that way. And then second as well, that then you have the normal status quo within Europe of not engaging with these parties at all. You hold the center. That's the whole status quo of Europe, which is now they've themselves broke, of course, with these last omnibuses. So, I mean, is that the case that, in that latter regard, that the middle is moving, that it's time for, because the administration, of course, and past administrations respected this block out the far right, we don't engage, to where now it's just, that's inevitability we have to work with? I
mean, that's hard to tell. It's hard to divine what will really come out of this, other than, meetings and handshakes. I think the cordon sanitaire between mainstream parties and the far right has been broken repeatedly on multiple sides for some time. I mean, so-called mainstream European parties participate in CPAC with, the most extreme forces of like U.S. politics as well.
Yeah.
And maybe not in official diplomatic settings, but this is, it's, one shouldn't read too much into this and kind of figure out what the reality is on the ground, and be better at thinking, what is your strategy in case of all scenarios? I think the European Commission has famously had a rather sophisticated way of having scenario planning and policy planning within its institutions, partially because it's always been able to be less subject to the whims of political cycles and take a more long-term view. Well, take advantage of those resources and that human capital. Think about what you want the long-term relationship like. And, maybe as an American, I should also emphasize that Americans should be thinking more about what the long-term relationship is like than what, the next Truth Social post is going to be.
Yeah.
And really think about how you use foreign policy as a tool to address problems both at home and abroad, which across the political spectrum has kind of been lacking and been a little too reactive. And I'm quite enthusiastic about thinking about more like, what is the forward-facing vision? Because again, we are going to stop talking about leaked draft of this or that sooner rather than later, and it's important to react, and it doesn't build any trust. But there's bigger fish to fry than what we write about each other.
Yeah, I agree. And before we move on to the next section, I still have to double down on this strand of kind of radical Eurosceptic thought with this administration, because there was an interesting point in the leak draft as well. I mean, like you're saying, this is a strand. We don't know exactly to what extent this makes up the administration, but clearly it's a growing extent of the administration. And we just had the U.S. ambassador in Brussels here as well talking about that, I think yesterday or maybe the day before. So, it's something that to be looked at. But they talk about the C5 to kind of take priority over this G7, this core five, which would be U.S., China, Russia, India, and Japan to meet regularly, just engage, like the G7 does, but with these five countries. But within this, it means Europe is locked out, completely irrelevant to the administration. And I think what's interesting too with this is that, second of all, these countries are all right now led by conservative far-right revisionist governments. So, looking at this specific strand of the administration, is it fair to say that they basically only are interested in working with these far-right revisionist forces, and until Europe is itself a far-right project, there just won't be courted or included in the same way?
I don't think the U.S. has a choice but to work with people that are not ideologically aligned to the current administration. And that's just not the way that foreign affairs works. I think, if President Biden had said, oh, we don't particularly want to work with, far-right leaders in XYZ country, everybody would have thought it's egregious. And then expectations have maybe shifted a little bit or been lowered. But the art of diplomacy is that you kind of have to work with people that you ideologically may not agree with, and that you may have pretty strong disagreements with people that you'd be nominally ideologically aligned with because the interests of countries differ. So, there can create new fora for this or that discussion. If somehow people agree to do the C5 meeting, what are the issues that are actually going to be addressed? What is actually going to come out of it other than a lot of pomp and circumstance? That's hard to tell. And if Europe wants to spend time and energy as part of its strategy to try to get into that grouping, then by all means, although I think it would end up being, the GG plus China at that point, effectively. And so, but the question is more about outcomes than process. And I think this is something that, diplomats have had a tendency to forget, is that in the end, what we're seeking are particular outcomes. And we should be testing each of our actions and our strategies by upholding particular outcomes and not assume that a process, just because it's been fruitful in the past or because it's innovative, is going to be, justify the ends or create ends that may not actually be possible.
All right, enough of Europe. Let's dive into Asia now. So at the forefront of the Asia section is the economic concern with China, of course, and that there should be, quote, a rebalancing of trade relations, reducing trade deficits, opposing barriers to our exports, and ending dumping and other anti-competitive practices that hurt American industries and workers. So apart from this focus on China's overcapacity, the strategy looks more consistent with previous policies. I think this is the one that's probably the least surprising of the entire document. Despite that unsurprisingness, to me, it appears that this document is kind of disconnected from the actual actions of this administration, like with the NVIDIA exports that we may be seeing now take place. How do you see this Asia portion?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what my take would be, is that, the whole document is going to have huge gaps between what it says and what they actually do. This section is the first one where it's already clear, a little bit more than 10 days or so in, right? We already know that there are inconsistencies, and there were inconsistencies beforehand. Let us not forget that, the U.S. should have done something to either block or force the sale of TikTok, and that no final agreement has happened. That basically the U.S. ended up agreeing for very little to reduce the sky-high tariffs that were put on China early on in the administration, to basically reduce them to nearly the levels of some of our closest allies and partners and the places where we would want to get some degree of trade with. The ending the export controls on NVIDIA's H200 chips is another just blow against many of these ideas. But the president has decided that there is currently an interest in having a closer relationship, a more managed relationship with China. And for the time being, the entire agenda is guided by that. This will happen with every other section of the document again and again. But I find it to be particularly inconsistent. I think our allies in Asia, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines, as well as in Australia and New Zealand, they are less concerned about what it says in the document, because what they say in read in the document is okay enough, maybe not actually hawkish enough. But what they will really be concerned about is the real implementation. And I think the rest of the world should feel the same way.
Yeah.
It's the implementation that matters. But already the implementation is concerning for some of our Asian allies, which are receiving both pressure from the administration to kind of increase their defense spending and kind of prepare themselves for Asia in line with the document, I might add. But at the same time that they see a U.S. that is kind of, little by little giving away concessions to the actor that, we're collectively trying to ensure that, we stay ahead of for the sake of both our values, our democracy, and really maybe human dignity. So I think that this will be a concerning trend, and more implementation will keep happening, but we should keep a very close eye in this relatively soft China policy that has been going on the last 3-4 months.
Relatively soft is kind of a fair way to put it, where it almost makes me wonder that most of the national security strategy is quite different from previous strategies. Then you get to this Asia section, and it is very China focused. It leaves out a lot of allies that normally would be more directly referenced and engaged with in that. But overall, it kind of just seems like they were like, yeah, we'll just fill this through, kind of pivot to Asia. But in the end, does that actually mean that maybe they don't care as much? That yes, it's a priority, but it's not as big of a priority as is this Europe focus, or in this, obviously this Western Hemisphere focus as well. It just felt a little sleepy to me, like they didn't actually care to take the time to articulate a vision outside of it's an accepted vision.
Yeah, and maybe that's the case. Maybe this isn't the priority for the people that spent most of their time writing and hashing out the document. And I'm sure that the great career people that are working in the State Department and the Pentagon and other places are particularly concerned by the implementation, especially when what this document is intended to do is to kind of give a sense of direction to the entire foreign policy mechanism, that the direction is going one way, but the tide is going the other, and that is a concern. That should be a concern internally within the U.S. I think Congress is going to be raising some of these concerns. Congress could very well be doing something about this, and are mostly choosing not to. Although there are some interesting and stronger provisions on China in the National Defense Authorization Act, and in the end, it's. That one is the law. The national security strategy is a piece of paper. And so there's something to be a little concerned about, as I said, this relatively soft kind of play right now. Let's see where it goes in the next few months.
All right, to close out this national security strategy talk, let's talk about Africa, which unfortunately we ourselves also won't designate much time because it also wasn't given much time. It was given half a page at the end of the document, just kind of put in there at the end. The document says that it will shift from foreign aid paradigm to investment and growth paradigm, a focus on critical minerals and energy. So is this not kind of an oversimplification, a bit extractive framework kind of bound to fail? Because the primary way of engaging in this region has been development assistance. So sure, if you're going to replace it with this investment thing, you need to see a top-down, investment push, but I don't see that actually happening. So in the end, are we not maybe handing the continent to China in this strategy?
I don't think the Africa section is terrible. And I think more of my esteemed colleagues that are much, much better experts at this don't think that it raises as many red flags as anything else in the entire document. Yeah. It is rather thin, which does say that this is not a major priority of the administration. But frankly, Africa has not been a major priority of any of the recent administrations, probably since the George W. Bush administration. And it would be foolish to pretend that it is a priority when it's not. And it probably should be far more of a priority considering how many people and how important the continent will be over the next few decades. But emphasizing investment is not a bad thing. I think we should strongly commend that, the Development Finance Corporation, which is a relatively new agency within the federal government. It was actually started during the first Trump administration with a law called the Build Act. This is, one of the most nimble and smartest actors in the U.S. government doing some really, really innovative development work. And it's a development work that has pretty large multiplier effects. It's development work that, brings in private capital. It builds infrastructure where it hasn't been lacking. It has created some serious competition in a few places to kind of the Chinese development model. And it's, for the most part, not huge amounts of sovereign lending, which helps the overall debt strain on the continent. So if that is their emphasis is to keep using the tool that DFC is, and they're giving more resources to DFC, and that was just authorized again in the National Defense Authorization Act. Yeah. This has good potential. I think, unfortunately, will it be enough to overcome the fact that, a significant chunk of healthcare provision, particularly in the prevention of HIV/AIDS and malaria and infant mortality on the continent has been funded by USAID and by PEPFAR and by other U.S. programs. That is all going to weigh. That is going to have, not only a cost in human lives, which is really important to emphasize, but also a cost on the dynamism of these economies. So yeah, sure, you can invest in infrastructure, but don't forget the human capital part of this.
Yes.
And that's maybe making it more instrumental than it should be. But like, if they want to deal with it in instrumental terms, there are plenty of instrumental ways to argue that this is really, really important. But at the same time, I don't think we should be too strong critics of the fact that there's a serious need for more private capital, for more lending, and for more resources in Africa, and that any direction towards increasing that is going to be good, particularly in energy. You know, energy poverty is the major problem for development in Africa. DFC has been quite good at funding energy programs, so I'm not terribly pessimistic about this. I think that there's a lot of promise. It depends on the perspective, and it depends on how this plays out over the next few years, but at least the right tool is in place, which is the DFC.
Looking at from kind of the competition angle, do you think the DFC is meeting the scale on the continent in which, engagement is needed to rival the engagement of China to be an actual, more appealing, viable option? Or is there a lot more work to be done?
Well, and here is where, and your podcast has a good and healthy emphasis on Europe. Here's, I think, where Europe comes in, right? The DFC alone doesn't need to match the scale of China, but the DFC plus Europe plus our Asian development partners, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, that are all doing excellent work, I might add. That combination, that constellation, that combined needs to be able to beat the scale of China. So far, depends how you do the numbers, it's not incredibly bad. The loss of USAID will obviously hurt that top line, and maybe this is a broader point, and we can have I could talk hours about this, but I think you need the allied scale on development in Africa, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, in the Pacific Islands. And as long as that continues to exist, you don't need to think like, okay, is DFC enough? DFC is great. DFC is very big. DFC is also doing a particular type of investments. And, where there should be a lot of potential for cooperation, and where we in a, democratic administration, that should definitely be an emphasis, would be, how do you make sure that you don't, do the same thing twice or double your efforts or waste money by not collaborating between kind of the allies. That level of coordination was starting to happen with, like the partnership for the PGII, the Partnership for Growth, Investment and Infrastructure, and with a select few projects. That just needs to be happening everywhere. And I think the DFC has actually plenty of like foreign policy and collaboratory authority to be able to partner with other agencies, both within the US government and also with other countries. Let's see how that's being leveraged. But Angola is a great example where, the Lobito Corridor is kind of a hallmark initiative of the Biden administration. It's successful because there's European and American led by DFC collaboration, and that should just keep going. And it is continuing.
That's a wonderful, really valuable perspective that I hope will be carried out and continue through the next administration. But let's shift topics to what many describe as the, quote, pay to play with Trump. So he's made clear that if you approach with favorable treatments, everything is kind of on the table for all, but for a price. This obviously takes domestic political corruption forms, but also it greatly holds significance for how allies and adversaries now have to view relations with the United States. And it also raises a really important role for the private sector in these relationships. So some place tariffs in this pay-to-play mindset. A few days ago, the CBP released that the U.S. has collected more than $200 billion from the new Trump tariffs this year. This is primarily, though, the U.S. consumer paying to play, and will more and more be the case as these companies start to account for the rough stability of these tariffs now being in place for some time. But of course, this does deter and enhance market access depending on how these markets play it. So do you believe there is a pay-to-play like this is being described? And if so, how does this dynamic impact relations and policy with the United States from our allies and adversaries?
Sure. I've heard time and time again, and I'm sure you have as well, people describing, oh, well, the U.S. foreign policy is shifting to a transactional foreign policy. I think all foreign policy is transactional. It just depends on how much you weigh every cost, right? Like, think about this like an economist, right? Like, what are your costs of particular things? It just happens to be that this administration takes brazen corruption as, a positive for themselves. And that is going to continue happening. I don't think that the EU is quite ready to gift a plane to the White House, but maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
But is this part of the calculation? Certainly. You saw this in the trade deals, because they're neither for trade nor deals, asking Europe to invest X amount of rather cooked up and vague in Europe, or As we were talking earlier about the NVIDIA H200 export controls being released, right? This came under the condition that 25% of the money that made from those has to go to the U.S. Treasury as a donation. This is the completely different ballgame, and this is something that members of Congress should be calling out, and some of them are. But it's a pretty interesting way to do foreign policy that I'm not sure that achieves the goals that the American people want for their foreign policy abroad. And as to whether the tariffs, I think the tariffs play into this in terms of the negotiation of these quote unquote deals. I think the cost being incurred by American consumers for these tariffs, they're not paying to play; they're getting played.
Yeah,
which is very different. But there's an alignment there, and I think other leaders and kind of the international community should be pretty aware of that. Like, in a way, they're currently on the side of the American consumer that doesn't want to be paying more.
Yeah.
But that the political winds don't particularly allow it for complicated reasons. But will there be a lot more of this kind of deal making that involves specific transactions or donations or, donate to the ballroom or something like that? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And this is corruption. And something we should be concerned about.
I think that's my biggest concern actually with viewing how globally folks should view relations with the United States, because sure, there's a pay to play, but it's really for those that are willing to pay and keep paying. Like Qatar has very successfully figured this out. Russia's doing a pretty good job as well figuring this out, but it's because they just basically will keep going. It's not like there's one thing. And I think that's kind of part of the issue is that, obviously these more democratic allies are not going to participate at this scale. And as a result, like with the EU-US trade deal or whatever that it came, I mean, there was like promises made. They seemed like they were paying to play a little bit. And then in the end, it meant really nothing. The US got what it wanted. Very myopic view. This administration moved on after and doesn't mean much in the end. So I in some ways, I feel like that there's people overvalue this pay to play to extend to many that are just not paying to play. They're paying to get through that moment. And then very quickly that moment is lost.
Risk of really overextending an analogy here. But I mean, this is an extortion racket. And And the problem with extortion is that they come back and ask for more. And I think one thing is making a promise in the Scotland Turnberry trade deal. I think one thing is making a promise that you're going to invest X amount in the American economy because you were going to invest that amount in the American economy through LNG purchases and weapons purchases and other things. That gets you kind of close to the outcome, and you just have to hope that the accounting works out, because last I checked, the EU can't coerce investment into a specific country. But you have to really hope that the math works out and that they don't decide, that the administration doesn't decide to change the terms of the agreement. And that, I think, is what we don't know. You're in the middle of negotiations, you kind of got something. I think European business, UK business, Canadian business, Mexican business, Japanese business are all rather happy that they've kind of like landed at this 15% landing zone with, more asterisks attached than anything else. And everybody's also wondering, how long is that going to last? And I don't think there's a clear answer. I think it's dependent on U.S. domestic politics, from like Supreme Court decisions about tariff authorities to, the midterm elections, to the effect of rising costs on the American consumer. But if you're really playing the, you have to give particular gifts to get particular outcomes, that is going to require further concessions, because you're not really negotiating at that point. I don't think that, Europe, Japan, Mexico, Canada, or any of them have reached the point in which they're not negotiating. They're just being extracted. Yeah. That's currently not the case, and I doubt that will end up being the case for everybody involved.
Yeah. So briefly, let's talk about the main negotiations on everyone's mind with the, bringing about the end of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So how do you assess where we are right now, firstly? And in assessing this kind of current negotiation scheme, what do you think will be necessary that we see come out of this that will actually enable Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction?
Sure. So I'll tackle those two elements. One is the peace negotiation. And I think currently where we are is that one side of this equation, namely Ukraine, broadly Europe, and the United States, are all negotiating with themselves. And then there's the other side of this equation, which is Russia. And the negotiation between the three on one side is and more than 3, but effectively 3 on one side, is going relatively well. They're talking about the details, they're hashing out the proposals, there are a lot of conversations going. I think there's, these ebbs and flows of panic that, something is going to go wrong because the US decides to go this way or that way. But this is still all on one half of the equation. Well, it's good that you're trying to hash things out on the other side. Peace requires the other side to agree to it. And I don't particularly see Russia being anywhere close to being willing to concede on anything. I think that there's still a pretty strong belief that they can win and litigate this on the battlefield. I think occasionally when there are incremental wins on the battlefield, this only solidifies that position. I think Russia has become very good at kind of keeping its war machine churning. It's able to kind of actually keep the economy running through some of the war production that is going on. It's managed to become quite good at recruitment. So for its side of the equation, this is not a great time to, do any particular concessions. And the war is relatively popular, as far as we know, at home. So while all of this talking is going on one side, and I think that talking should continue, I don't expect there to be any urgency on the other. And I think there's talk about the U.S. Planning the next round of sanctions as a way to kind of bring Russia to the table, then they might bring Russia to the table, but that doesn't mean that the conversation is going to be particularly fruitful. Until these dynamics change, and they may, nothing is going to happen. And I think much is done about the U.S. wanting to get too close to Russia, and I think that ebbs and flows a lot.
Yeah.
But I think the bigger conversation is peace won't happen without Russia agreeing to it. And whether the U.S. decides to be really, really tough, like the oil sanctions that were passed, or whether the U.S. decides to be very soft. So far, it doesn't seem to change the Russian position at all.
Yeah, I would tend to agree, and I think right now that this Russian regime and the Kremlin, I mean, they basically know they can finance this war for the years to come, and they have full backing from their allies. And so I think as long as they see that they can outspend us, and they have the manpower, as you're saying, that's that. And that's where I think, these sanctions are a good thing. I hope there's more sanctions levied against Russia. But really, I mean, we have Belgium that's unwilling to use Euroclear to have this reparations loan. Europe is unwilling to put its neck out there to actually back this. And then we have a U.S. administration that won't give any new aid packages as well for Ukraine. So in the end, I mean, they're functioning at a deficit for this year to come. And if Russia knows that, then why would they stop? So I really think the main signal we have to give is that we're willing to spend more money and put our necks out there to make sure that Ukraine can defend themselves and win this war. But yeah, until then, I mean, why would Russia stop?
Yeah, and I worry about the softness in the numbers. And, there's been some polling, and I don't want to overweigh this, but I think I worry about the softness in the numbers, in that clearly both the publics in the U.S. and in Europe strongly support Ukraine, but they're growing a little bit impatient with how long this whole thing is taking.
Yeah, they're getting tired. For sure.
And the impatience is not unjustified either, right? Like, this has been going on for a long time. It has had an effect on, prices, stability in Europe. I think the hybrid attacks going on from Poland to Belgium to Denmark.
Yeah.
These are all adding to kind of the instability. We've seen great reports about hybrid attacks in the US from, I believe it was the Financial Times. This is increasingly brewing, and this means that eventually the domestic support. And as I said at the top, foreign affairs is first the relationship between the people of the country. Here, there's some softness. I think there's also some willingness to negotiate a little bit more on the Ukraine side. But what nobody, again, is saying is where did the Russian people land on this, and where does Russian leadership land on this? And there, I think that Putin might see this as a waiting game, and we have to make sure that it's not. But also be decisive.
I will say, to kind of close on this specific note, that the Biden administration did a wonderful job at communicating to the public of the need to support Ukraine. And without that, I think many are unaware of this Financial Times article you're talking about. No one has any idea that Russia was putting bombs on civilian planes and sending them through Poland to the U.S. to try and create 9/11 level events. I mean, that's a remarkably terrifying thing that most are unaware of. And I'll add to that as well that, I mean, we're approaching the holidays here, and Russia loves a good holiday to have a moment of escalation while we're all distracted. So I think these negotiations will continue, but I think there will be probably a shift as well in the next few weeks, which will be a bit bleak. But let's continue forward. So right now you are the director at Brzezinski Global Strategies, a boutique geostrategic advisory firm based in DC, focused on Central and Eastern and Northern Europe. So Can you just walk me through the importance of commercial advisory in today's evolving geopolitical landscape?
So a little bit of what we do is we have looked at one of the most dynamic regions of Europe, right? This is kind of your Poland, your Baltics, your Nordic countries. These are places with quickly growing economy, with like innovative landscapes, right? And we know that there's a lot of enthusiasm, particularly from American companies, investors, to take, to become part of and seize the opportunities, the business opportunities that come from the dynamism of these regions. Politics and geopolitics are complicated. There is certainly a lot of uncertainty in international affairs today. Our expertise is helping companies navigate that and both understand the risks, the challenges, understand the things that, those of us that are, nominally foreign policy experts, if anybody can be called that, how to steer that and be able to seize the opportunity on their side, because it's enormous in these places. The U.S. economy is doing relatively well, depending on the metrics. There's a lot of enthusiasm, and it's very interesting because the top line narrative is kind of this era of deglobalization and all of this. And I think there's been a lot of uncertainty injected into globalization, but there's certainly no unwinding of like this integration, right? When people think about like there is a move towards friendshoring, nearshoring, shortening supply chains and all of this. Well, the US and Europe have a, very integrated trade economy. Shortening the supply chain does involve partially building things in Poland or getting your best innovators on finance, technology, pharmaceuticals from Scandinavia. I can give a dozen other examples. And so as a firm, we advise clients on these dynamics. We help kind of unlock an understanding of how these dynamics play out.
So what is top of mind when you're engaging on this? Is it kind of regulatory dynamics? Is it the on the ground realities like you're talking about? Is the war top of mind? I mean, what mostly are people seeking to understand when they're talking with you?
Regulatory dynamics are clearly top of mind. I think for a lot of American both companies and investors, the European landscape is still one where requires a little bit of expertise and understanding, particularly the connection between the regulation and the politics. You want somebody to address your politics, you should probably just hire a lawyer. But if you want to understand, you want to look over the horizon and understand, well, is this investment worth making? And what does the regulatory landscape look 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the line? This is something that we can understand the politics and their relationship to regulation. And so this is something that they ask about a lot. I think maybe people in Brussels and in other places would be amazed by how many like American C-suite executives have heard of the Draghi report. And their big question is, so when is this thing getting done? When are they passing the Draghi report?
Question here too.
And it's like, well, actually, it's not, you can't pass the report, but you can certainly pass on the report, which may be what's actually happening. But so there's a lot of enthusiasm to kind of seize the opportunity. These regions are young, dynamic, and there's a lot of interest in that, but it requires a little bit of kind of hashing out and looking over the horizon. I think there's a lot of promise in kind of the potential that Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction will have. It's an incredibly high potential economy. We get questions about that. There's a lot of potential. There's also risk involved, both governance, politics, and really no reconstruction will happen until there is a pretty stable peace on the ground. And this is something that both the Ukrainians and the Europeans are keenly aware about. So these are the kinds of conversations that we're having. We're really thinking about some of these insights and what we can do to kind of clarify the stormy weather into something that you can fly through.
Yeah, just speaking about Ukraine and this kind of market opportunity, obviously it's a market heavyweight and what it is and what it can be and how much of foreign investors, when they're looking at Ukraine, are thinking about Ukraine's future in the EU. Is it something that it's a minor factor or top of mind of what it means to enter that market?
Yeah, it's something that they're definitely thinking about. I think it's not the highest question, maybe. I think European integration will certainly, ease access and all of that. But I think there's also an expectation that, if the day the war ends is the day reconstruction begins, but the day the war ends is not the day that EU integration begins. So if you're a business trying to seize opportunity, the opportunity begins the day that there's like a stable, durable, lasting peace that allows for a dawn of rebuilding Ukraine, and that European integration to some degree will be an important part of that, but that it won't happen immediately.
Yeah.
And so you don't want to be the person that waits for for Ukraine to be part of the EU in order to invest in it. And you see this in the Western Balkans, right? If anybody was waiting to invest in the Western Balkans for EU accession, they would still be
Yeah.
waiting.
Yeah.
But I think the same applies to Ukraine. There's clearly a lot of opportunity. I think there's the bigger open questions is what happens to the several million Ukrainians currently living in the EU after the war is over, and whether they return to Ukraine or not. I think Ukraine kind of needs them to return for the reconstruction, but that's a difficult thing to offer.
Especially if this war continues for some time more, the longer people stay. But I want to close with the importance of soft power, because you know it very well. You served as the special assistant to the deputy director of the Peace Corps during the Biden administration. And as we talked about, this administration talks about soft power, says it loves soft power, but of course we've seen Peace Corps headquarters gutted, offices closed abroad, USAID gone, democracy promotion programs also cut, and just greatly affected as well those that were branched off of it around the world. So this is a global effect, but at the front of it really is Europe, which has been left out to dry in many regards of this. What do you see as the actual on-the-ground impact of this more or less abandonment of soft power? And what do you think are the long-term implications for the U.S. global standing?
Sure. I mean, I think this connects a lot of threads, but I would first be really, really remiss to not say that, thankfully, Peace Corps is both still around and still going strong.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And two, that anybody in your American audience at any age between 18 and 99 should consider joining the Peace Corps and serving 2 years abroad, working on incredible development work as one of the, unfortunately, last few standing development agencies of the U.S. government. But the good work doesn't stop, and they're, incredible volunteers in 59 countries doing all kinds of amazing development work. It heartens me to think all of the good work that they're doing and how much we need to keep supporting them. And I think maybe let's pull together a couple of the threads broadly on soft power. I think, as I said earlier, I think the U.S.'s soft power mostly comes from the American people. This is why I'm, such a strong believer in Peace Corps. And Peace Corps is not a tool for soft power. Peace Corps is a tool to do development work overseas.
Mm.
It just happens to buy us a lot of goodwill. But the spirit that it reflects is the spirit for the American people to do good for the world, and that hasn't gone away. And I think it would take a lot more than a political sea change to change that core spirit. I think our allies and partners should always, always be heartened that as long as the American soul and spirit continues to be what it is, and something that, like me, a lot of other people, and I think like you, also strongly believe in, that their alliances and their relationships with the U.S. might go through a lot of ups and downs, but it's not going to disappear. But it's also, and you and I as Americans and kind of internationalist Americans, it's our responsibility to make sure that that continues happening, right? And that both other Americans see the benefit in our engagement and our entanglements with the world. Something as simple as there are more Americans with passports traveling abroad now that there have ever been in American history. Only very recently that more than half of Americans had a passport, which for a lot of other countries is particularly developed countries, it's a very low number. Americans' ability to travel and to go other places is wholly dependent on our foreign policy. It's wholly dependent on our relationships and our alliances with the world, and therefore, the trade relationship, tourism is somewhat counted in trade and services. The enormous trade and services benefits received by countries in Europe and countries in Asia is part of why we are in these relationships to begin with. So soft power begins when you start thinking about the actions of the American people. Gutting USAID, which is horrific, and was done in a terribly horrific way, is a huge wound in the side of American soft power. But it's not, it's not death of American soft power. I think reputationally there will be speed bumps to the U.S. relationship. I think that has happened historically. I don't think that, U.S. history has a long kind of perfect track record. So I think that it's important. Now, talking about how that kind of interplays with the relationship with Europe, I think the hard part here is that in many ways, Europe has lost the government partner in regions outside of Europe. You can read the national security strategy and worry about what the U.S. is going to do in Europe. Europe can kind of figure out how to stand pretty steadfast within Europe. The question is, what happens in the rest of the world?
Yeah.
In every single conversation that the U.S. was involved in foreign policy, You know who was one of the parts of the State Department that was always consulted, no matter the region of the world? The European Affairs Bureau. Famously, and this is really getting into the weeds, but famously, the European Affairs Bureau is the bureau that has the most signature lines on paper and on internal documents at the State Department. Why? Because the U.S. collaboration with Europe is not just about what happens in transatlantic security or transatlantic trade. It's what happens in the entire world. Mutual partners of first resort, and the first people that you call when you want to do something in this world. That is not completely disappeared. That's still happening, but that's gradually withering away.
Yeah.
And the question for Europe is, what do you do when, your first partner doesn't pick up the phone anymore or does something without calling you first? That is a difficult dynamic, and that exposes Europe to its really honest need to invest far more in the world. Opinion pieces that you and I both read and had conversations about how the Europe should fill the gaps in at least HIV/AIDS spending that the U.S. pulled out. As far as I know, there is zero signal of even an attempt to do that. Even in places within the Europe's own interests, like Radio Free Europe and Voice of America programs, there were proposals to do something about it. None of it has come to fruition. So if there's a global ambition to be kind of an equal partner for whenever we reestablish this stronger alliance, and one that is an independent actor, that underinvestment is not a possibility. And I think this is something that the American people have wanted from I think, you can go and poll, like, Americans expect Europeans to play more of a role in the world as our partners.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's a gap that needs to be filled, and I see little to no concrete plan to do so.
Yeah.
And when, conflicts arise, the border skirmishes between Thailand and Cambodia, there are European diplomats that are working behind the scenes to figure out this, and there are American ones that are working on this. The president has repeatedly wanted to play a role in the peace process. The question is, are those two playing with each other and working with each other as they always have? And if not, then what do we need to do to keep that happening? And if, where Europe has vested interests, it should continue to figure out whether, the U.S. is a partner of first resort. It might temporarily not be. But this is a really, really important world leadership gap. It's unfortunately something that the U.S. is currently abdicating a lot of responsibility on. Vacuums are filled by players with completely different intentions. And this, I think, is much more at the core of the transatlantic alliance than just immediate issues, which are important and feel very pressing. But it's really kind of this integrated web of cooperation that the U.S. has played an enormous role in, and that if Europe wants to continue to have it seizing the benefits of, it may need to play a much larger one. And this goes beyond a Trump presidency. I think that this will be a long-standing trend. And this goes for allies in Asia as well.
It's an extremely important point. And I remember when I was speaking with a high-level EU official who worked on sanctions, they basically were like, look, if we want to figure out sanctions evasion that's happening in Armenia, we call the Americans. We don't have the capacity. They do. They'll know exactly what's going on. We'll sort it out together from there. And I think that's a part of the issue here is it's a capacity question. But to fix the capacity, you have to have the purview of all the ways in which parts of the EU or parts of national governments within Europe are working and functioning. And right now, a lot of that isn't the case by nature of a lack of a federalized European system. And so I think there is, like you're saying, not enough work being done to fix this at the moment. But, there's the Commission's proposed new intelligence unit, which the idea would be kind of to overview all the intelligence apparatuses across member states. And, this could be a good start. This could be something to think. So I think that that's really where Brussels needs to be thinking about this, is just consolidating to even know where to build these gaps out, because it's been such a deep dependence for so long of just call the Americans and we'll sort it out from there no matter the issue.
And if federalization at the EU level is very tricky, I think there's a little bit of an emphasis, particularly in the Brussels dialogue, about like, well, if it's not pan-European, it doesn't exist at all. You do have 28 member states with like the capacity to be experts on things individually, right? Already so many of the the member states call each other for being the experts. The U.S. called probably continues to do so. So, if it is impossible to consolidate some sort of capacity at the European level because you have a veto player here, veto player there, don't forget you've got your own budget, you've got your own country. Go start your own thing that like does your expertise, and then offer the services because, you're in a union. Offer those services to both the European Union writ large and also to your partners and allies. So I think the emphasis on like it's federalism or bust ignores that, like, there's a lot of things you can just do on your own, and that you're rather choosing not to do at all because you don't really want to do that on your own. You know? And this is something that, like, you can see the history of the United States about, like, what things does the federal government do versus what states do. Very often it's a mutual passing the buck exercise. And that to me is not a detriment or a bug in the system. This is a feature. And if you forget that it's a feature, then you will treat it as a problem and do nothing at all. Use it as a feature. And I think this is even something that the U.S. needs to relearn how to do. I think there are parts of the federal government that are way too involved in local issues, and there are local issues that are way too involved in kind of preventing good livelihood from happening. And maybe this is, a complete divergence into, like, U.S. domestic politics, but there needs to be a little bit more creativity and a little bit more willingness to play with the tools that you can quickly and easily build. And maybe I'll take a connecting thing to my top line thing. I just threw my pen. And that is that, like, you have to work with the world that you have, not the one that you want.
Yeah.
Necessarily, and really seize these opportunities as the ends that you are seeking rather than the means, right? Don't fall in love with the process. Fall in love with the outcome.
100%. Very well put. Pablo, it's been awesome to have you on. Thank you so much for joining the show.
It's been really, really great. I've been looking forward to this.
Thank you for listening to the Immutable Ledger. I hope you enjoyed this episode. As you can see from the Charlie Brown Christmas tree in the background for those watching on YouTube or Substack, it is the holiday season. And happy holidays to all. As always, if you have any comments, questions, or feedback, here's my email, analysis@samuel-dempsey.com. And with that, I'll see you at the next episode. Happy holidays.